Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the recently released competitive multiplayer game Overwatch 2, and see how it compares both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the final version of the original game. For this analysis, both games are being played on a PC, with the visual settings set to their highest available options at a native 4K resolution, though settings like motion blur have been disabled in order to provide cleaner still images. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first taking a look at the changes that have been made to the game's characters. Now what's interesting about Overwatch 2 is that it isn't exactly a separate game from the original. In fact, it's more of a massive update and relaunch than anything else. Because of this, all of the original character models are preserved in the sequel, and can still be selected as a usable skin for each of the playable characters, right alongside the much higher fidelity Overwatch 2 variants. And as you can see, the differences here are pretty drastic. One of my biggest problems with the previous Overwatch was just how low res so many of the character models appeared, with older HD textures contributing to a really muddy appearance when playing the game on today's much higher resolution 1440 and 4K displays. The newer Overwatch 2 skins, however, are built with these higher end displays in mind, with crisper details, more textured surfaces, and more complex geometry. The appearances for characters have also changed a great deal, alongside all those technical improvements, with more intricate details like lights, scratches, metal fasteners, and additional moving pieces, helping to really modernize the original designs, all without compromising the original's cartoon-like art style. A lot of the characters have seen some subtle changes to their hair and beards as well, with more complex specular lighting giving it a more pronounced appearance, along with very small additions to the stylized groupings of hair to give them more depth. One of my favorite examples of this is Lucio, who's not only sporting some new neon-colored extensions, but also has actual textured dreadlocks this time around, rather than the weird, zigzagging things he had growing out of his head before. Mei is another great example of this improvement to hair rendering, as her hair is now more full with hundreds of identifiable strands and better light interaction, while her fluffy white collar is now more intricate than the ugly, low-res triangles that made up her collar before. As for the new designs for these character outfits, most of the choices that the developers made seem wholly consistent with the character's previous design, with the same color schemes and critical identifiable features. And there's also a few subtle changes made that try to add a little bit of personality and evolution to these characters. Bastion, for example, feels slightly more refined, with more rounded out materials and cleaner outer plating, suggesting that he's a newer, more polished model. Then there's Moira, whose right arm now plays a more direct role in funneling her powerful decay energy to her hand, unlike before where it appeared like the metal implants along her arm and hand were responsible for channeling it all. Orisa has no doubt received one of the biggest changes, as her design now appears to share some similarities with Lucio, especially with the large cables protruding from the back of her head, similar to Lucio's neon-colored dreadlocks. There are a few changes that I feel don't work quite as well, like Genji's new sweatshirt that covers up his cyborg ninja-like torso, but more often than not, the newer skins look much better than their old counterparts. Alongside all these new character models are a plethora of redesigned first-person weapon models that similarly sport new 4K texture work and other interesting changes. Some characters like Sombra and Symmetra, for example, now have these new energy-based connectors that were previously represented as more basic ribbon cables and wires. Meanwhile, Junkrat's grenade launcher has seen its tire swapped out for a gear instead, along with a new, more ergonomic charging handle replacing the old stick shift from before. And then there's characters like Pharah, Winston, and Roadhog, all of whom have received several new higher-res texture maps alongside the surface of their weapons, in addition to new gold trim and other decorative details to help the model really pop on the screen more. Like with the outfits, all the changes here contribute to a cleaner, better realized version of what we were offered before, with several small changes to keep the model looking fresh without completely burying the original design. Though, just like with the character skins, players can still select between the old weapon skins if they prefer. Next up, let's talk environments. Overwatch's level environments are gorgeously detailed, with a multitude of unique locations from across the world, all populated with intricate details and a remarkably large number of dynamic props. For the most part, each of these level environments remain nearly identical between the two games. All the objects appear in the same places, all the pathing is the same, and nearly every texture map appears to be retained. That being said, there are a few rare instances where Blizzard did make some subtle changes. Route 66, for example, now sports a large boulder here by the cliffside, likely to prevent players from being launched off the cliff as they round this narrow corner. The interior of this distillery in Havana also sees some new stacked boxes near the rear entrance, along with a few more added outside. And interestingly, there's even a few textures that have been changed as well, like this wall texture found above an inaccessible section of the Rialto map, or the neck of this small bird, where the feathers are no longer distinguishable like before. But other than those very few examples, the changes I found in the shared maps of these two games are nearly non-existent, which is a real shame considering there's plenty of areas that could have benefited from some updated texture work and geometry. In addition to returning maps, Overwatch 2 also sees a few brand new maps as well, all beautifully detailed with colorful building facades, dynamic physics-based props, and some competitively designed pathing that takes full advantage of the game's new 5v5 philosophy. One of the most striking new maps in the collection is Paraíso, a Rio de Janeiro-inspired hybrid map, with a ton of brightly colored neon structures interspersed with plenty of interweaving alleyways and rooftops to battle across. Altogether, Overwatch 2 includes 6 new maps, half of which are only playable in the new Push game mode, and thus have much longer, somewhat symmetrical design elements to them to serve as a sort of tug-of-war battleground. Unfortunately, as Overwatch 2 has removed the Assault game mode entirely, this means that several maps from the old game will not be returning at this time, including the Cherry Blossom-rich Hanamura, the Egyptian Temple of Anubis, and the Russian-inspired Volskaya Industries, along with the previously removed Horizon Lunar Colony and Paris that were cut for similar reasons. Overwatch 2 also appears to have dropped the hybrid level Numbani as well, though this appears to only be temporary and should be re-enabled sometime after launch. Moving on, let's talk about the lighting. Outside of all the new maps and characters, the lighting is probably one of the most apparent changes that have been applied to the sequel. Almost every map from the original game, while fundamentally the same, has had its time of day adjusted a noticeable amount, with maps that previously took place during the day now taking place at night and vice versa. It's a fun way to mix things up, changing up the monotony of playing the same levels over again, and giving them a new visual tone and appearance. Though I can't help but feel that every one of these maps looked better during their original time setting. Dorado is probably one of the biggest culprits here, as the new daytime setting takes away from the gorgeous decorative lighting fixtures used to complement this center market area. Lijiang Tower is another great example of this, where the new early morning setting isn't nearly as visually interesting as the light rain at twilight that we had before. And then there's the maps that were set during the day but are now set at night, that are robbed of the great color variety that made these maps stand out. It just seems like a really needless change, and I feel a better choice would have been to allow multiple times of day for each of these maps, rather than just removing the better looking versions of the maps altogether. Thankfully, not every map has seen this change. The lighting in some maps has instead only been altered slightly, with an increase to bloom and sun glare like in Junkertown, or changes made to the global illumination in Havana that make the interior spaces like these alcoves here appear a bit brighter than before. In some levels, the volumetrics may have been changed, toning down God rays in some areas while increasing them in others. Overall, it really doesn't feel like the lighting has been improved all that much. In fact, it almost feels like a net loss. But the shadows are an even bigger area of concern, as I found multiple instances throughout the sequel where some shadows are either improperly placed or removed entirely. Take this section of Havana for example, where previously every object here would cast a shadow relative to the static sun positioned above. But for whatever reason, the sequel appears to be missing a group of shadows here, including this central palm tree and the cannon sitting below it. There's also a new shadow map that's weirdly placed over top of this short tower, despite there not being any object above that would cast this particular projection. In other areas, where the shadows remain intact, the coloration of the shadows appear lighter for some reason, despite the color of the scene itself remaining nearly identical. Then in Junkertown, I ran into some similar issues, as small detail shadowing for things like this tire here or the lower arrow sign are missing, while new shadows for newly implemented details like this light fixture have been added. It's a weirdly mixed bag for what's essentially the exact same shadow rendering technique. And it's likely that the missing shadows that I've mentioned were simply unintended omissions as the developers worked on reconfiguring each map's lighting effects. Next, we have the effects. The effects in Overwatch 2 really haven't changed much from the previous game either. All the same environmental destruction, bullet decals, and particle density from before remain intact, with the only changes being the new particles contributed by the newly added characters. Water simulation and fire effects remain a low priority for this game, as these elements play no real significant role in the gameplay, and so nothing appears to have changed for the maps that contain these decorative elements. However, I did find that the fire rendering in maps like Route 66 does look slightly worse than its predecessor, with less defined flame alpha effects and fewer of them. So now, let's talk a little bit about what actually has changed, by highlighting some of Overwatch 2's biggest new features. First off, Overwatch 2 adds in 3 new characters on top of its already massive roster. This includes the tank Junker Queen, who's designed to play an aggressive role with up-close encounters and special bleed effects. Then there's a new DPS character, Sojourn, who's equipped with a full auto rifle that can be charged up with a powerful secondary railgun attack. And lastly, there's Kiriko, whose powerful support abilities can remove negative effects on teammates and quickly heal them with thrown charms, while also tossing out deadly kunai knife for longer range attacks. Then there's the changes that have been made to the pre-existing character roster, adding in a new system of passive abilities to each of the various roles that subtly transforms the gameplay experience. A few characters have also been reworked from the ground up, most notably Orisa, who's had her shields and defensive abilities swapped out for new javelin-based maneuvers that make her a much more powerful tank character. Doomfist has also been reworked a great deal, and has been repurposed from his previous role as a melee-focused DPS to a tank, who has significantly more health, can block incoming projectiles with his arm, and can leap long distances instead of using his old uppercut. Speaking of tanks, Overwatch 2 also drops the player count from its previous 6v6 design to only 5v5, forcing teams to rely solely on one tank player this time around. This changes the game considerably, as tanks now need to play much more defensively than before, making deflection and team damage mitigation a strategic focus. This also greatly speeds up the gameplay, as team wipes are now more common, and weak links within teams are often more easily identified than ever before. This is also aided by the reworked in-game scoreboard that provides a more detailed breakdown of players' stats, replacing the old metal scoreboard used before. To aid in communication, Overwatch 2 also adds in a ping system, complete with context-sensitive pings to alert players to specific enemy positions, perfect for IDing pesky snipers and other potential ambushes. Player progression has also seen a big change, in that Overwatch 2 now utilizes a Battle Pass system, rewarding players with new skins, characters, and other cosmetics through consistent playtime, rather than the old randomized loot boxes from before. Accompanying this is a new free-to-play distribution model that requires new players to grind through the ranks to unlock characters, while veteran players should have all of the classic characters unlocked by default. And wrapping up the major changes is the addition of a new game mode called Push, that pits 2 teams against each other in a sort of tug-of-war, where they must escort a single robot along a track in the middle of the map and have it push a barrier to the enemy's goalpost, while preventing the enemy team from doing the same. It's essentially a 2-way escort game mode, and a solid addition to the returning game modes from before. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which game do you think offers the superior audio presentation? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Overwatch 2 is less a sequel and more of a large update. There's very few visual changes to really appreciate here, outside of the great character model reworks and the 6 new maps. Considering how many muddy, low-res texture maps still persist from the original game, it's a shame we couldn't at least see these cleaned up with newer 4K variants. And while the changes to time of day for some of the maps are interesting, they don't really lend themselves to the locations as well as the original lighting choices. And I do wish there was a way to select between them, rather than being stuck with these new choices. The real meat of Overwatch 2 then boils down to the fundamental gameplay changes, mainly the new focus on 5v5 gameplay, and the increased strain it puts on tank mains to escort the team to victory. The new characters also appear to be good additions to the roster, though we'll no doubt see some major balance adjustments in the weeks to come, as they do feel exceptionally strong choices at the moment. Together, I believe all these changes do facilitate a worthwhile return trip to the competitive world of Overwatch. But if you weren't sold on this fast-paced hero shooter before, then this only-in-name sequel will probably not change your mind. So what do you guys think? Are you happy with the changes that have been made for Overwatch 2, or do you prefer the design of the original game? Let me know in the comments section. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.